Yeah, please. Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Maja House, Amritsar's premier platform for literature, culture, arts, and ideas. Continuing our series of talks and discussions in August, the month of India's independence, where we mark 75 years of freedom by talking about our so called minorities. We have had illuminating discussions on the story of the Sikhs, and yesterday we had one on Ghazala Wahab's wonderful book called Born a Muslim, where she talked about what it means to be Muslim in India. And today we are focusing on another community, that of the Jews in India. And we have Professor Ori Soltes with us. He's edited a fascinating historical account of the primary Jewish communities in India, their synagogues, their unique Indian Jewish traditions. And it also describes how the Jews first arrived here in this country and then created their own diaspora by moving out of here and relocating, especially to countries like Israel and the US. The book, of course, is completely beautiful because, as all of Neogi's books, the publisher is Neogi Books in Delhi, and as all their books are beautifully produced with fabulous photographs and gorgeous plates. We have Professor Soltis with us here today, and he's going to take questions at the end. Trisha De Nyogi, who's also here, the publisher, will be in conversation with him, but that will be after we are done with the illustrated talk that he's going to give us. Professor Soltis is based in the US, and he currently teaches theology, philosophy, and art history at Georgetown University. He spent a lifetime wrestling with questions that resonate through the history of the human experience. And what I've read is that his lectures, his curating of various exhibitions, and his writing all reveal his unique ability to be thought provoking, to be challenging, and intellectually extremely exciting. So we're really looking forward to this talk and to the conversation afterwards. Over to you now, Gina and Trisha, for the um, let's hear the talk first and then get on with the conversation. Thank
Just
you
before
once
we go
again for
there,
being here.
just before going in, I'm itching to show the book to everybody.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yeah,
And this is the book that we're going to talk about today. Growing
yes.
Up Jewish in India. So,
Hi, everybody. My name is Orizi Saltis. I teach here in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown University, and I'm the editor of the book Growing Up Jewish in India, Synagogues, Customs, and Ceremonies from the Bene Israel to the Art of Siona Benjamin, published beautifully by Neogi Books. I want to tell you a little bit about the book before addressing questions that anyone might have. It's a bit of an idiosyncratic book. It layers its narrative in an interwoven manner, moving from the outside in, as it were. So after a beautiful little foreword by Ralphie Girard from Mumbai, there is a preface by Erica Lyon. Erica Lyon, or Lyons, I suppose, as an American I should pronounce it, who lives in Hong Kong, wrote a preface that discusses broadly how the Jews arrived into different parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia and East Asia, much of which, at least for an American audience, will be new information. And then my introduction in the book talks about how diverse India itself is as a place of many, many languages, 23 official languages, many, many more dialects, and diverse religious traditions that include not only, of course, Hinduism and Islam, more Muslims soon in India than anywhere else, but Christians, Jews, Sikhs, Zoroastrians, Baha'is, an extensive array, and of course, diverse cultures, ethnicities, and all kinds of traditions, so that India would have been a natural place, and it was, a natural place for Jews to settle, and not only settle in different parts of India, but come from different parts of the world to India, find a home there that was comfortable for them among their diverse neighbors, and spend centuries making lives for themselves here. I'm sharing screen with you right now, and so you can see this rather schematic map of India with the three primary Jewish communities, that which is organized around Kolkata, that primarily is referred to as the Baghdadi Jews because their point of origin, or the most immediate point of origin, seems to be Baghdad and that area, so Iraq and Iran. And the Kochini Jews down in the south, around the southern western part, Kerala of India, and around Mumbai, primarily the Bene Israel Jews that constitute the largest community. And as the book lays, first of all, out the story of these three communities in three different chapters, the order is Bene Israel. This is a chapter that I wrote, followed by a discussion of the Kochini Jews, written by Orna Eliyahu Oron, who's in Israel, and Barbara Johnson, who is in the United States. And finally, the Baghdadi Jews, written by Yael Silliman, who is in Calcutta. So we have an international authorship, as it were. These three communities each constitutes a chapter with beautiful images, in many cases taken by the authors, in other cases gotten through archives, in a third case provided from the collections of Siona Benjamin, about whom more in a few moments. But we see, for example, one of the Baghdadi synagogues, the Magen David synagogue, in a rather neoclassical style with the teva, the bima, the pulpit in the center from which the Torah scrolls are read, and the seating all around the periphery, the men's section below, the women's section above, and in the distance you see the area where the ark, the Holy Ark, is placed, embedded in this wonderful archway where the Torah scrolls are kept. And if one looks at a little detail, you see how beautifully appointed it is with this starry sky and obvious Jewish symbols. The Star of David is relatively recent as a Jewish symbol. It is much more universal and goes back perhaps as many as 7,000 or 8,000 or 9,000 years. And in the Jewish tradition is very much regarded as the Jewish symbol only since the 1890s. On the contrary, the seven-branched candelabrum, of which you see two here, is the quintessential Jewish symbol that goes all the way back 2,000 years in Jewish art history. So this book, our book, offers us, as I said, an array of images. Here you see another of the wonderful Baghdadi synagogues. Sorry, the previous was Baghdadi. This is a Kochini synagogue, the Paradesi synagogue, and a very different style kind of teva or bima. And you can see the Holy Ark is covered more simply by a curtain in this case. Beautiful tiles that reflect part of the relationship that India has had historically with the West, in this case, the Dutch. And here we're looking at another Kochini synagogue, the Ernkad interior, and again, yet a different sort of style for the raised pulpit, the bima, the teva. And we're looking here from the perspective of the Holy Ark, looking toward the back so that we're seeing the raised area of the women's section in this particular case. And here you can see an image of the Kad-Em Ark, which is the Holy Ark, which is how it is depicted in the book, surrounded by inscriptions and a little detail from an image that I'll mention later by Siona Benjamin. And so we move through these different cultures and their synagogues and their customs and traditions. This is yet another Kochini synagogue from Pune, the Sukkot Shalom, and you can see the congregation or some of it there, and beyond it, the raised place from which the Torah scrolls are read. And again, the Holy Ark where they are typically kept. Here you get a little closer view of that with the Ark curtain, the parochet, which is the Hebrew word that referred to the curtain before the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem. So it associates throughout the Jewish world, not just in India, throughout the Jewish world, every synagogue on a visually symbolic level with the temple in Jerusalem of the past and the traditional hope in the messianic future for the rebuilding of that temple. And so that very important item is referred to as a parochet, as I just said. Now, one of the distinctive and interesting features of the architecture of Indian synagogues, and this is yet another example from the Kochini community, this is the Parur synagogue, is this breezeway. So here's the main structure, and there would be an entrance area here just off your image. And then you get from the entrance area to the synagogue by way of this breezeway. And obviously you can walk along ground level, and that's typically what the men would do because they'd be going to ground level. But the women would go through the interior of this breezeway. So you see it here. And that would also protect them from the elements as they come to the upper part of the synagogue. So we see synagogues that I've just shown you, and there were many more images, of course, than the ones I've shown you from the Baghdadi community, from the Kochini community. I'm turning to the Bene Israel community, not by way of a synagogue image, but rather by way of looking into the Ahmedabad synagogue just north of Mumbai, where we're looking actually into the Holy Ark and where we see a pair of these sacred Torah scrolls that contain the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And in the Indian tradition, as in the Sephardi tradition and the Middle Eastern tradition, the Torah scrolls are kept in this hard carapace called a tik. And as you can see in this case, beautifully appointed with velvet, with silver, with crowns, and with the pointer with which you read the Torah, and you open the whole thing that stays vertically to read from it. In the Ashkenazi, the Northern European tradition, the Torah scrolls are kept in a soft carapace, which is removed, and the Torah scrolls are laid down to be read. So it's a different kind of tradition. And here you see one among many examples from the Tiferet Israel synagogue of the eternal lamp, the Ner Tamid. In fact, it is, you can see part of the Hebrew inscription that uses the word Ner, light, candle, and the light of eternity. It's to reference, it's to symbolize God's eternal presence. So the Ner Tamid will be found in every synagogue before the Holy Ark, and it is never allowed, the light is never allowed to go out. So the first 3 chapters talk about synagogues, customs, ceremonies. Within the Bene Israel community, for which there are half a dozen different traditions as to exactly when and why the community came to India, perhaps the most well-known and the most commonly held is that the community grew out of a series of survivors from a shipwreck, 14 survivors, 7 women, 7 men, along the Konkan coast, and what they had with them was very little. Even their holy text had been lost. But in any event, they eventually weave themselves into the community and become part of it, just as would be the case in other places at other times of the Kochini and Baghdadi Jewish communities. And the story about the Malida platter, which is what you see here, you can see it's rice with flowers and a variety of different fruits and nuts. It's rather delicious, and you'll find a Malida platter as part of any important ceremony, whether it's life cycle, whether it is festivals across the year. And the interesting thing about it is the most common story of the origin of the Malida platter is that they were constantly, the Bene Israel community, invited to join with their Hindu and Muslim neighbors for their respective religious feasts. And they realized these guys all have special dishes that they bring to the table, pun intended. We ought to have something as well. And so they developed the Malida platter as a consequence of that imperative. And it's a unique form of Bene Israel gastronomy. Even more unique, perhaps, is the particular relationship with and fascination for the biblical prophet Elijah, who, according to the Bible, at the end of his life didn't just die, but was carried up into heaven in a fiery chariot led by angels, And the tradition that subsequently developed post-biblically within the Jewish tradition is that Elijah would return just before the Messiah arrives. And so, for example, at the Passover feast, every Jewish household across the Jewish world has a special goblet of wine that is left on the table for Elijah. And there is a tradition of opening the door toward the end of the Passover celebration, the Passover meal, to welcome Elijah in with the hope that he shows up, and if he shows up, the Messiah will. Well, the Bene Israel have a particular relationship with them, such that what you're seeing here is a site where the tracks of Elijah's chariot are marked by this burning color, and ceremonies take place at this site. And it's, of course, typical of the tradition, not only within India, but across humanity, of stories about heroic characters, that there are always elements that encompass the imagination and defy absolute doctrinal reason. So if the biblical story would seem to suggest that he rose to heaven somewhere in what is today Israel, Palestine, Jordan, yet the Bene Israel tradition has his rising up in that chariot from a place within India, so that it establishes a particularly strong relationship between the Bene Israel in India and Israel. So the community to community, the place to place, the polity to polity relationship. And so every household is likely to have an image like this, which shows Elijah being carried up to heaven in that, well, it's not a fiery chariot in this particular image, it's a chariot, the wheels of which are emitting fire, leaving the imprint that we just saw, and being guided by angels. Now, you'll notice I didn't choose for the book a nice brand new image. I chose one which, as you can see, is quite well worn, and that's because it comes from the home of the grandmother of Siona Benjamin. So after the foreword, the preface, the introduction, the 3 chapters on the 3 major communities, we arrive at a wonderful memoir by Siona Benjamin, who inspired the book. She is the one who grew up Jewish in India, in Mumbai, surrounded by Muslims and Hindus, going to schools that were variously Catholic and Parsi, Zoroastrian. And of course, her community and her friends was made up of people from all of those traditions. She felt no discomfort as a Jew growing up among non-Jews because they didn't think of themselves in those terms. They just thought of themselves as Indians. Siona came to the United States to study art about 30 years ago, and she ended up staying on. So she, within herself, is an interweave of a number of different, identities. She's Indian, she's Jewish, she's American. And the memoir talks about her growing up in India and eventually her coming to the United States. So I'm just showing you 1 or 2 images. There are many more in the book, of course. This is the young artist with her father to our right and her mother to our left. And of course, they're with Indira Gandhi, who is at that point the Prime Minister of India. So it gives you a sense of how interwoven and comfortable within that community they were. And conversely, this is an image of Siona now having lived in America for many years, having married with a daughter, Rachel, and now she's visiting India. This, in fact, is a synagogue in Cochin, where we see before this beautifully appointed holy ark, the image of Siona and her daughter. And so we get her story out of this memoir. And the chapter that follows talks about the art of Siona Benjamin. So you see her here before one of her works. Now I'll show you the work in detail. I wanted you to get a sense of how large that particular one was. It's from a large series called Finding Home, because one of the features of herself and her own identity with which Siona wrestled shortly after coming to the United States was where she fits in. She was shocked to find when she went to her first feminist conference that Westerners assumed that because she came from India, not the West, that, wow, you speak English? They were surprised at that. They were surprised at how aware of the world she was. And she was surprised at how unaware of the world outside the West they all were. So she said, when anyone ever says something that makes me feel uncomfortable because it's prejudicial, I find my skin turning blue. So here you see this blue-skinned image of a fereshta. So the subset series of Finding Home is fereshta. As you all know, it's the Urdu word for angel. And this is a subset of that subset, a series devoted specifically to the character Lilith. And so her name is written in Hebrew, Lilith, night creature. In the medieval Jewish tradition, Lilith is a kind of demonic character who was created at the same time Adam was created in the Garden of Eden, but she could fly. And she refused to be subordinate to him. And she ended up being punished by being thrown out of the garden. And then, of course, Eve would be born in that biblical tradition from Adam's rib. So by definition, out of him and subordinate to him, Lilith was punished. Every day, 1,000 of her babies is killed. There's all sorts of ugly traditions about that and about how the fact that she, as a demoness, then haunts prepubescent boys, young men alone, and that sort of thing, babies that she robs them. But Siona is part of a tradition that has transformed the understanding of Lilith into a positive, a kind of heroine, someone who is there for us. And so you see her with her wings, you see her bearing the bullet, you see her with this wonderful halo out of the Islamic stylistic tradition of Persia. And you see her with this quote, 1,000 years I have waited, keeping the embers of revenge glowing in my heart. It's kind of like Lichtenstein's pop art in America that she has synthesized to these other aspects of her art. And that's what she does, synthesize spectacularly. Here you see an image from the same Fereshta Finding Home series. This isn't Lilith, however, this is Asnat, a minor character in the biblical narrative. She is the Egyptian wife of Joseph the patriarch, the son of Jacob. And we see her portrayed by Siona as if she is a Mughal prince with the sword, with the contrastive to the strength that the sword begets, the contrast of lotus blossom, that is the softness that it also presents. You see her dressed in garments that are at once Mughal, on the other hand, of course, connote the American flag. And you can see Katya written there in Devanagari, in Urdu. What's going on, right? Who, what? And on the other hand, she has done a whole series of beautiful illuminated manuscripts. This is a magnificent book of Esther, the Megillat Esther. And you can see the text beginning as it does in Hebrew, and it will follow all the way through. But you can see not only is illuminated in a manner that suggests Mughal art, and here's Esther herself. Here's another style of representing a king. This is the King of Hazawaris, where you actually see him only from the chest up. And you'll notice that by the opening with the blossoming in Devanagari, she has indicated what this is about. You can recognize Esther there in the Devanagari writing. On yet another hand, Siona got a Fulbright, actually a pair of them, a few years back, and she went back to India to study the remnants of the Jewish community, most of which has moved to Israel and a smaller number to the United States, but there's some still there. This is specifically her own Bnei Israel community in Mumbai. And she did a series of images. This is one of them. This is a fellow by the name of Daniel Gadkar, who between the time of this image and now, alas, passed away, but he was the one who kind of care-tended this beautiful white synagogue. And you see him embellished by a gold circle that suggests Byzantine Christian art, and then swirling also in gold, the most fundamental statement within the Jewish tradition, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And blessed be the sacred name," and it goes on and then it tails off, interwoven with this wonderful henna pattern that one can imagine on the hands of a Bnei Israel bride. Here's a second image from among this series, and I'm showing it to you for a particular reason. This is Esther Belkart, and you can see her with members of her family, but she is embedded in the center of an image against the background of which, as you recognize, is the ghosted image that you just saw a few moments back, that classic Bnei Israel representation of Elijah on the chariot. And in Hebrew, in beautiful blood red, Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet is written, but then the whole thing is in turn framed by this frame that you can see is filled with the images of faces out of the Hindu tradition of heroes, of gods, of heroines, of goddesses. My favorite, of course, everybody's favorite, Ganesh there with his elephant trunk. So again, one different aspect of Siona's art after another reflects on this sensibility of synthesis and combining the different influences on her that have been part of the life that she has lived from Mumbai to New Jersey. Yet another series that she did a few years back, which takes a poem by Emma Lazarus, a Jewish Sephardic immigrant to the United States at the end of the 19th century, that ended up at the base of the Statue of Liberty, that symbol of American freedom, where the culminating lines are, I lift my lamp beside the golden door. But Siona did the entire poem, and you're looking at the last image in this series, so you can see the golden door is there, and quite literally, we have that golden door. And again, a lotus, and again, a blue-skinned figure. And I remind you, every blue-skinned figure is, well, it's at least three things. It is Siona herself. It is in its blueness, the color of the sky, the same sky that is over all of us, regardless of where we are. So a symbol of our continuity as a human race, as opposed to the discontinuities and the particularities of I'm an Indian and you're an American, I'm a Beni Israel, you're a Kochini, I'm a Hindu, you're a Muslim. All of those particularities are subsumed under a vast commonality that we share. And thirdly, of course, within the Indic tradition, blue is in particular associated with Krishna, and yet we have not Krishna, but a female here, and more broadly with other divinities as well, but in particular, Krishna is blue colored. So we see even in that little detail, different elements feeding in. And you can see stylistically how she's incorporated a whole new vocabulary as compared to the other images that I've shown you, a kind of abstract, expressionist kind of vocabulary in this wonderful bluish image. But let me come full circle back to the series with which I began, the Finding Home series. This is number 46. And this particular painting, and it's small, this is about 12 inches high, is called Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam is the Hebrew phrase meaning to repair the world. And you can see that it's written here in Hebrew, Tikkun Olam. And what she has done on the other side is not to translate it, but to transliterate it. So in Devanagari, the writing of Marathi and of Hindi and so on, that was originated with Vedic and Sanskrit, you see Tikkun HaOlam, repairing the world. And the figure who, to repeat, is Siona herself, is all of us, is Krishna, is Shiva Nataraj, is Kali, is dancing the dance of creation and continuation, her foot on a lotus, her upraised hands in mudras that have, of course, positioned those hands as hamsas out of the Muslim tradition of the stylized five-fingered image. And of course, there are 7 of them. That menorah image that is the most historically common image to the Jewish tradition, and all of these culminating in stylized frames that you realize looked like simplified houses. It's home. Wherever I pitch my tent, that's my home, is what Siona realized as she emerged as an artist to produce work, the point and purpose of which is to draw together the threads of diverse traditions so that none of them is favored, so that all of us as a species are ultimately favored. The last chapter, a kind of epilogue, pulls this together by way of a discussion of the expanded Jewish community of India, not in numbers, because most, as I said, migrated, but in fact, by the 1970s, a group of members of the Mizo and Kuki tribe from the north, from the Himalayas, reconstituted themselves as a Jewish community, claiming that they refound the Jewish identity that they had left behind centuries and centuries earlier. So they constitute the Bnei Menashe. And by the 1990s, 1991 to be more precise, a group from the south, from Telegu, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that word, reconstituted itself as the Bene Ephraim. So that functionally, there are therefore 5 distinct Jewish groups that come out of India, most of whom live in Israel. And what you're seeing here is an artist representation of a new Indian cultural center in the northern Negev that is built up around a Kochini cultural center. And the Kochini Cultural Center and the Indian Jewish Cultural Center helped subvent the publication of this book, helped sponsor it. And so we see in this last chapter the expansion in new directions of the vibrant Jewish community in and out of India, in a vibrant India, as they all move forward. This is intended to be a stylized lotus, of course. And as you know, the lotus blossom closes up at night, but then it reopens in the morning. So it becomes a symbol of the cycle of rebirth, of samsara, that is endemic not only within the Indian tradition, the Hindu tradition, but of course, in this context, the Indian Jewish tradition that has seen itself revived in new places as it has moved forward in new times. So I thank you for your listening, and I look forward to your questions. Bye for now.
Please unmute yourself.
Yes, I understand. I got so engrossed in the session that I actually forgot to unmute myself. So it was a beautiful, beautiful session, and that prompted me to ask. I want to ask you a couple of questions right now. But if there is anybody who wants to ask a question, may I request you to please put your questions in the chat box so that we can take it up as soon as we are done with a few questions that I would like to ask him. So the first one, this is now, you mentioned about the number 7 in the menorah image, and also in your chapter on the Bene Israeli, that is the first chapter, you've mentioned that one of the origin stories, you also mentioned it during the session, and in which 7 men and women survived. So may I request you to elaborate a bit on the number 7 and the significance as an important sacred number?
Absolutely. And it won't surprise you to hear that every tradition seems to have an affection for the number 7 and associated often with the idea of completion and perfection. And if we look for an origin for all of this, and again, it in a way it goes back to Siona's use of blue because it's the sky that's all around us. Well, when we look up at the sky, and if we study it and we're not victimized by light pollution, and we don't have television sets, and we perhaps don't even have books, so we're going to spend a lot of time looking up at that. And what we observe is, against the backdrop of the sphere of fixed stars, there are 7 entities that on a reliable periodicity make their way across the heavens. Okay. The Greek word to wander is planeo. So these are called planetes. So the planets that in diverse traditions are associated with divinity. And in the English language, we still retain that: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Sun, Moon. These by way of the Roman, and in turn, they got them from the Greeks and the Etruscans, and in turn from the Persians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians. The 7th then becomes associated with divinity by way of the planetes, the assumption that the gods are somehow up there, okay, and therefore with completion and with perfection. And then it, of course, offers its particular nuances depending upon the particular tradition. So you have the menorah, and of course, for Judaism, it's associated with the menorah in the temple. It's associated with the commandment to keep the 7th day sacred as the Sabbath. And the different traditions have different specific takes on it.
Yeah. Thank you very much for elaborating that. Now our next question is from the last part of the session, that is on the 2 groups of Indian Jews, the Bene Menashe from northeastern India and the Bene Ephraim or Telugu Jews from
Right.
southern India. Now they've sought recognition and have received acceptance, I believe. And so
Yes.
could you tell us a little bit more about these groups because we hardly know anything about. I've just heard their names in passing,
Sure.
not knowing anything about them.
Well, the Bene Menashe, we can trace back as an animist group. They actually were headhunters going back through many, many, many centuries. And then oddly, in the late 19th century, Welsh Presbyterian Christian ministers converted a group of them. But within that group, and it's a relatively small group within a larger group, in 1951, one of their leaders had a dream in which he recognized the ancestry of their group as Israel. And they began to understand their own ancestor as Menashe, who is the son of Joseph. That image by Siona of Asnat, I said it's the wife of Joseph, the patriarch.
Yeah.
So he had two sons, Ephraim and Menashe. So this is one of them. So they began in the 60s and 70s and 80s to study Judaism and to try to relearn how to be Jewish. And by the end of the 80s and the 90s, they began, many of them, to migrate to Israel, where eventually they were accepted and understood to be a Jewish community. And on the other hand, the group that called themselves the Bnei Ephraim, and Ephraim is the other son of Joseph, from a completely, the opposite side, at the opposite end of India, most interestingly. And arriving in the late 80s at this sense of having derived from a Jewish tradition. Their tradition asserts that they too were part of the northern Israelite tribes that disappeared to history when the Assyrians conquered the northern part of what was then Israel in 722-21 before the Christian era. So that's 2,700 years ago, that they wandered gradually east for about 1,600 years until they ended up in the south, that southeast part of India about 1,000 years ago. But again, they had along the way lost their connection, their contact with that tradition, which then reemerged for them toward the late 20th century. So two very interesting stories indeed.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Then we have one question by Sanghamitra. She's asking roughly what number of Jews are still residing in India, whether in Mumbai, Kolkata, Cochin, or any other Indian city.
If I'm not mistaken, there is probably not more than about 5,000 Jews all told still resident in India. So the vast majority have moved to Israel, and they maintain a connection to India. Their view is very simple. You know, this is way before the more recent idea of dual passports. You know, Indian Jews think, you know, we all have a mother and a father. So they think of Israel and India in the same way. I have a mother and I have a father. I love them both. They're different and they're both part of what I am. So they see themselves as both. And so they maintain a constant interconnection between living in Israel and again and again and again visiting India.
Yeah. That's beautiful. But I'll play a devil's advocate and ask you one more question on
Sure.
that. We know that many chose to go back to Israel, to go back to the new nation of the Jewish people when it was well established. But some of the Cochin Jewish communities, have even transported parts of the synagogues built in the traditional Kerala
Yes.
architectural style. Could you tell us a little more about it? Is it like taking a part of their heart with them?
Absolutely. I mean, it's symptomatic of their sense of continued connection. The concern that if we do all leave for Israel, there's no one to take care of the synagogue and it's going to fall apart. Well, why don't we take it with us? And so there has been a proliferation of an enormous number of Indian Jewish synagogues in different parts of Israel, reflecting these diverse communities, and in many cases, the synagogues themselves either virtually entirely transported, or at least important parts, like the Holy Ark, for example, will be inserted in whatever synagogue they build. And if it's built from scratch, very often the style in a modernized version will reflect the style from which they came.
Yeah.
Even if you think about the Jewish Community Center, that last image that I showed, the intention, of course, as a stylized lotus, I don't even have to explain, right? Its connection to India. And if I had had time to show you artists' conceptions of some of the details, transporting plants and flowers and trees from India. So there's a whole garden that is intended in that community center that will be like you're walking through a part of India.
Absolutely. We have less than 2 minutes right now.
But we have a nice question from Shrutimala also, Tisha, because that's also Northeast, like what you talked about a bit earlier.
Yeah, I'm just going to it. In our Northeast, hundreds of Bene Menashe have left for Israel. But when and how were they lost and came to settle in Northeast?
So the question, the simple answer is, according to their own tradition, they would have been part of those northern Israelite tribes lost to history. Same with the Bene Ephraim, the Bene Menashe, because the nation of Israel in antiquity divided between Israel in the north, Judah in the south, after the death of King Solomon, 5 years after his death. And then 200 years later, the Assyrians swept in and the northerners disappeared to history. And they migrated to various parts. If you think of the world of that day, mainly they would have gone east. So they ended up eventually in India. And so both those groups have a similar narrative of that, although the Bene Ephraim have that more specific, we wandered for 16 centuries, we arrived in India 1,000 years ago. The Bene Menashe don't have that specific a sense of exactly when they arrived, but the idea is they eventuated up into that northeastern part of India. The language they speak is related to Tibetan. So it's not part of the language group that includes Hindi and Marathi. It's not part of what you find in the South with Dravidian languages. It's from a different group, and so on. And the wonderful thing about every origin story is, if you're part of it, it's just true because it's where you are and it's what you are and where you came from. And then you get us outsiders who say, well, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. The hell with these outsiders, it doesn't make sense. Of course it makes sense because it's real, it's part of what you are.
Yeah, very interesting. So with this, we've almost run out of time, but I wanted to show everybody the cover of the book, which is taken from Siona's work as well, and a little bit about the back cover because it's also beautifully designed. And one of the pages from inside, I kind of particularly like this image. I don't know why. This and with this.
Do you also, Trisha? I mean, I'm just jumping in, but would you like to tell us about that? You know, the cover image you just showed, because it's
sure.
Sort of.
Well, it's that interior one is a 7-part image. In fact, apropos 7, and it is installed. It was installed in a church. So Siona was invited to this church in New York City to install this very large image, because many of her things are small, but this is large. And there is before it a kind of plinth on which there rests a kind of golden image of a ram, and which this alludes back to the time of Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's surrounded by images that refer to different characters, particularly female characters, that are part of the tradition that she brings forth. So yeah, you can get a sense of it from there. And you can see in the center, particularly if you're not looking closely, it looks like it's right out of the Indian tradition. You think, who is that? Is that Parvati? Who is that? You know? And this reflects Siona's interest in synthesizing the diverse aspects of what she comes from and doing that as a purpose, the idea of, as I said, tikkun olam in Hebrew, repairing the world, a fractured world, by bringing people together, by engaging in this kind of interweave.
Yes.
Fascinating, absolutely.
There's some very.
By the way, the cover image is derived from her grandmother's. It's a Miriam image, but that green covered sari that she's wearing was her grandmother's. So it's a very personal thing as well as a more broad kind of image.
No, it's really fascinating because, like I said initially, there are just little bits and pieces that we know about Jewish history. Somehow everything seems to be overtaken by the Holocaust and, all of that really terrible and traumatic stuff that happened. And of course, then the building of Israel itself. And then
Sure. Well, I love the fact that Israel and India achieved independence at about the same time. So I've always thought of them as having kind of parallel stories of, in just a chronological sense. So it's appropriate that there be this kind of interweave.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So
Thank
with
you.
this, I'll thank Professor Saltis for doing this session, and Preeti ji for giving us this opportunity to talk about this very, very, very interesting and important book of our times. And with this, I hand over the mic to you, and thank you everybody for joining in and lovely questions.
Thanks very much, Tisha, and thank you, Professor Soltis. And if you'd like to stay on and listen to the next talk, which is on Afghanistan, please do. I'm asking Dr. Arvinder Chamak now to take over and introduce the next speaker and the session.
Thank you, Preeti.
And please, everybody, stay on.
Yeah, thank you, Preeti. I would request everybody to please stay on, and since it's going to be a really very interesting session. And thank you, Professor Ori. It was indeed a wonderful session. Now, the session which we are going to conduct now is the land which housed different faiths and cultures for centuries together. Now, be it Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Muslims, and invaded invariably by so many like Ghaznavis, who could even maintain the Hindu forces, the Mughals, the Mongolians. But what happened that in today's time, that suddenly the land started to disown their own natives. The ones who were present in millions at one time are now reduced to not even hundreds. Dr. Inderjeet Singh from Nottingham has done extensive research on taking the historical and the geographical account into his work, the land of Kandhar Naresh, the one of Mahabharata, and now the land of Talibans. So a very interesting book of Dr. Inderjeet Singh, Afghan Hindus and the Sikhs, the history of 1,000 years. So please, we welcome you to the Maja House, sir. Indeed, an honor to have you on the board. And now you can start your detailed, extensive research on the topic, what has happened in the past, what is today's scenario, and what is going to happen in the coming times. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Inderjeet.
Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure and honor to be here with such august audience. And I will start, how did Afghan Hindus and Sikhs left the country? So they started living in the country around about in 1980s, when things went bad from a security point of view, and the civil war started, and Russians had invaded the country, Mujahideen started. So I will start, before I touch that, I will briefly give you some indicators or some bullet points. Afghanistan has always been in the 19th or 20th century a conservative country. It was only in about 1920s when Amir Amanullah Khan, he reduced the jizya by half for Hindus and Sikhs. The Hindus and Sikhs since then till this stage are considered as outsiders. So although we may consider them as outsiders, but the history tells something else. Because as you said, narrative is created by the people who are in control, but saying that there's also one aspect that they were very much part and parcel of the Afghan society. By 1950s, during the era of the last Afghanistan emperor, Zahir Shah, the jizya was totally abolished. Hindus and Sikhs were given the same rights, almost the same rights. They were also given the chance to join the army, which Afghan Sikhs joined. They also, in fact, in particularly the Sikhs among the two groups, they, due to their martial tradition, which is in the Indian Punjab, but still they were very proud. They were allowed even to wear uniforms on Vaisakhi. So during Amanullah Khan's in 1920, the first time in Afghan history, the government participated in the Vaisakhi celebrations. So one can, I'm telling you from that, his previous emperor was very much a conservative, and he just persecuted the Shia Hazaras community. So coming back to Zahir Shah, so you had the last emperor of Afghanistan deposed by his cousin brother, Muhammad Daud Khan, and it was a bloodless coup. The Zahir Shah was somewhere in Europe, and this gentleman, Muhammad Daud Khan, took over and declared Afghanistan Republic. There was no bloodshed. It was a bloodless coup. Nobody came outside to protest against the king, in favor of the king, protest against the new regime. So it was a very seamless transition, as we have seen in a number of Central Asian countries, even in next door neighbor in Afghanistan, Pakistan, sometimes in Bangladesh, and sometimes in Burma as well. So it was things didn't change much for Afghan Hindus and Sikhs. They were very much part of the society. They were, in fact, encouraged to, during this era, they rebuild a lot of their temples, gurdwaras. So, and Muhammad Daud Khan was considered to be closer to Russia. So India, in geopolitics, Afghanistan had some territorial boundary issues with Pakistan, so the relations with India was always good. So throughout the 20th century, since Indian independence, the relations had been good. And and interestingly, the Afghan Hindu Sikhs are known as Hindki, people from the Hind, people from India, rightly or wrongly. So that had a positive effect during that era. So in 1978, Muhammad Daud Khan was assassinated by the Communist Party of Afghanistan, and they put their own president, who himself was assassinated a year later. And in December 1979, we had Russians invading Afghanistan. When I spoke to the Afghan Hindus in Kandahar, who have now settled in UK and in Germany and in India, they tell that the movement against the Russians started in Kandahar. And initially the Hindus and Sikhs supported them simply because it was somebody has occupied a country, and there was a big wave of patriotism. So they were supporting them at times financially. And many intellectuals joined that movement. But as the movement progressed, like all these movements happen, anti-social elements started coming. So whosoever was on the wrong end of the society, or you can say was sought after by the police, would leave Afghanistan and go to Pakistan. Similarly, people who go from Pakistan, who were needed by the police, would go to Afghanistan. Now, in this era, radicalization started to happen because Russia and India was very close in the Cold War era, and Hindus and Sikhs were deemed to be Indians. So you had a lot of propaganda against, obviously, Russia and India. and Indians, which is Afghan Hindu and Sikh. And that had a huge effect on them. Traditionally, Afghan Hindus and Sikhs have lived in the Pashtun majority areas of Afghanistan. Pashtun form about 45 to 50% of the population. Kabul is the only exception. Kabul used to be a Tajik majority city, but I think now it's evenly divided between a lot of other communities. So there is no one community majority in Kabul at the moment. So when I spoke to the people in Kandahar about it, Dr. Raghunath Ashna is still is a doctor. He's about 69 years old. He still lives in Kandahar. And he took pains. He took pains to tell me that he said, "Mere desh wale bahut bhole the." But they were very simple people. They were radicalized. So they were not like this. So don't think that things were always bad for us. And he took really pains. But by mid 1980s, people from Kandahar, the greater Kandahar, and Rozgan, Helmand, most of them left Kandahar and went up north, which was receiving less war, less relatively more peace. So they went to the cities of Ghazni, Jalalabad, and Kabul, which already had Afghan Hindu Sikh population. Why did they left Kandahar? Well, their houses were looted. They were told it. Basically, they were people now started believing that it is fit to loot kafir, infidel. So things got really bad for them. They went to Jalalabad, Ghazni, and Kabul. Afghan, by this time in the late 1980s, the Russian had realized that they are not going to win this war. The guerrilla warfare of Mujahideen. And if you've seen the history, even the Zunbils, which sometimes say we say Hindu, sometimes say Buddhist, or sometimes a pagan dynasty which ruled between Kandahar and Kabul between 7th to 9th century for 200 years. They used the terrain and the guerrilla warfare effectively. In fact, the Iranian or the Arabic army couldn't defeat them for 200 years, simply because the same terrain benefits everybody if you know that area. So coming back, another development which happened around about in 1988 for the first time, this is an attack happened to Afghan Sikhs. On Vaisakhi of 1988, a militant went into the Gurdwara and killed 14 Sikhs. But there was security provided by the government, and 4 Muslim Afghan soldiers were also killed. So this was 1988. By next year, problem arose in the sense that the Mujahideens were already on the outskirts of Jalalabad, another major city with Sikh population. The local governor said, "I'm happy for you to come to some sort of negotiation, some sort of a settlement. I don't want to fight with you." I mean, and that is an aspect which I will discuss later on. But since he was representing the governor of Nangarhar or Jalalabad, was representing the government in Kabul, which was Dr. Najibullah, who was deemed to be a Russian puppet, which he wasn't, but that was how he was portrayed. So he said, "I need to bomb unless you sunder." I said, "I can't sunder you as such, but I don't want war." So, okay, they reach a compromise and a map was given to the Mujahideens that this is the area of Jalalabad where Hindus and Sikhs live, so you can bomb there. So, so you see, so over the period of rockets, if somebody was old enough, there was I've forgotten the name of that rocket. It was very common, and even you have if one of the Rambo Sylvester Stallone movies, you have seen those ones rockets. They started coming, and about 100 Afghan Hindu Sikhs were killed over a period of 6 months. So it was not like it was a bombardment which was going infrequently on a weekly basis. These people now wanted to leave Jalalabad. They were not allowed to leave Jalalabad because the government in Kabul didn't want it panic to create. So I'm talking about 1989 over here now. And in December 1989, the Russians left the country. So you're talking about April, and about after June or July 1989, they left. They were allowed to leave Jalalabad, and they all came to Kabul. So similarly, like now, you have all the Afghan Hindu Sikh vast majority of them now had concentrated or have joined their brothers in Kabul. So they were living now in the Gurdwaras. In Kabul, things were pretty normal. So they were in two minds what to do. But since Dr. Najibullah, as I said, had very good relation in the government, he didn't want it to create panic in the so-called everything is fine in the country, and Hindus and Sikhs controlled the currency market over there. They controlled in Kabul. They although they were a very small community, people have given a number of figures, but I don't think they were more than 100,000. But they were very much part and parcel of the trade, the merchandise. They would import and export things. They used their language skills, which is Dari, Pashto, and also the Indian language, well to their advantage. So, and they were historically the traditional bankers. So people in Afghanistan didn't trusted the modern banks, they trusted Hindus and Sikh more. So even in the Pashtun belt of Frontier province, there is saying that if you want to buy stuff, go to a Hindu shopkeeper or a Sikh shopkeeper, they will charge you fairly. So they had built this reputation all this time. So there was, but Dr. Najibullah told the Indian government, allegedly, or Indian embassy, that don't give more than 4 or 5 visas in a day. Because people wanted to leave. The Kabulite, the people in Kabul, Jalalabad didn't want to leave as such because, but geographically, Kabul and Kandahar are like in India, you have Delhi and Bombay. So, but cultural wise, they were quite different. So people, the Sikh and Hindus wanted to leave at this point, but they were not allowed to leave. Only 5 visas was given. So roundabout in beginning of 1992, Dr. Najibullah realized that Mujahideen were outside of Kabul city, and they have been saying in their announcements that we can never trust Indians and Russians. Obviously, they will say Russians and Indians. So Indians meant the Afghan Hindus and Sikhs. And when they entered the city, just like this time around, it was through peaceful means. Basically, Dr. Najibullah resigned. He went to the UN office. They entered unopposed, but they came to the main Sikh Gurdwara, which is Singh Sabha Gurdwara Kate Parwan. Interestingly, all the Sikh and Hindus are still there at this moment at the time. It's a big Gurdwara, but it was built in 1960s. And they basically raided the Gurdwara to find the transmitter because they thought the Indian Afghan Hindu Sikhs must have been transmitting some vital information from there about Mujahideens to the Indian government or the Russian government. Obviously, they were the most transmitter. And at that point, Dr. Najibullah decided that, okay, these people, I cannot guarantee their safety of the Hindus and Sikhs. So he asked his departments to give them all the visa, all of them a speedy visa to India, and they can leave if they want to. Even in those times, there used to be a couple of flights every day from Kabul. And in fact, on one passport, 3, 4, 5 visas were given because not everybody used to have a passport in at that time among our Afghan Hindus and Sikhs. So, and he still remembered. His daughter lives in I think in Mumbai. He's still remembered with great affection by Afghan Hindus and Sikhs. But interestingly over here, people didn't leave that soon, because the Mujahideen entered in the city without any bloodshed, bloodless transfer of bloodless coup, I can say, or seamless transition. After a month, this was April 10, 1992. After a month, Gulbuddin Hikmatyar came to the Kabul, and he realized the Tajik Ahmad Shah Massoud and General Dostum, who's Uzbek, they are in the government, and he was Pashtun or Pakhtun, and he asked for his share of the government, and they declined it. So what happened was he started bombing Kabul. So the Mujahideen themselves, and it was the beginning of a civil war within the Mujahideens, and Sikh and Hindus traditionally used to live in the area called Shur Bazaar, which was the old Kabul area, and rockets would come every day. And what happened was Ahmad Shah Massoud took the Guru Har Rai Gurdwara Sahib and made his camp, den, whatever, and he was defending himself or the city from Gulbuddin Hikmatyar from the Gurdwara. So with it, that lasted for 18 months or so, which destroyed a major part of Kabul city. And during that period, what also happened was the people who were basically classified as the security guards, they started looting the Hindus and Sikhs over there. In fact, in one case, and people started selling their properties at 50% rate, 30% rate, whatever. So in one case, they even negotiated a deal, paid the 50% money. In the evening, they looted him and killed him, the same person. So with all this scenario, despite the fact that in fact, mass majority of them never had any relative in India, despite the fact that they can't remember anybody or any country except Afghanistan. They were dubbed as infidels or Indians, and basically fit to be killed or fit to be looted. So within the next 18 months, 50,000 of them came to India. So over a period from 1992 June till 1994, they came. 50,000 of them came to India, and now obviously from India they went. Many of them went abroad. About 10,000 of them decided not to leave. The problem of the Sikh and Hindus now start, which continues till date, and it's important to know now. In 1992, so when all this bombardment stopped, obviously Taliban came in 1996. So I'm talking about 1995, when all this has stopped. When these Afghan Hindu Sikh who decided not to leave the country, when they decided to go their home, or whatever left of that home, the land was basically occupied by powerful neighbors or warlords. So those issues or those problems never finished. Their houses, which were illegally occupied, were never given to them till date. In Jalalabad, the Sikh and Hindus had orchards, agricultural land, because it was a smaller city, which was taken away from them. They had shops which were given to them. In India, it's called pagdi. You pay an amount of money, and then you're giving a lease, lifelong lease, as long as you are paid. You pay the rent, monthly rent. That was taken away, and no money was given to them, because the Mujahideen said, well, there is no way that you can operate such a business as per the Islam. So the only thing left for them was their homes. And similar thing happened in Ghazni as well, because These cities were the provincial capitals. So they were destroyed more during the civil war between the Mujahideens themselves rather than the other way around. So, and then we had the problem of Afghan Sikh school children being bullied in the school. Obviously bullied for, they have a patka, they have a juda, and they, in Afghan language, potato is called kachalu. So they would touch their juda, they would or the patka. So what happened was they stopped going to school. So in the last 30 years, since 1992, there's hardly anyone who has completed 10th class. Forget about college, forget about university. These problems never went away, even during the government, the last 20 years of democratic regime. Yes. Okay, before I wanted to touch on these one. So when Taliban came in 1996, they defeated the Mujahideens. They couldn't defeat Ahmed Shah Massoud, who went to the northern part of the country, but 90% of the country was with them. Hindus and Sikhs paid jizya, and interestingly, the Taliban left them alone. They didn't do anything with them. There was an incident, interesting incident, which I would share, which I put in my book, that in Jalalabad, the Sikh shopkeepers were told not to serve any women who comes without a male with them. A male has to be a husband or father or a brother or something like that. But some of their soldiers, Taliban soldiers, would, at the sight of the Sikhs, would spit on the ground in disgust. And obviously the Sikhs were not happy with it, but those guys had guns and they were a small minority. So one of them once spit, and instead of spitting on the floor, on the ground, he spat on the Sikh face. And these were cloth shopkeepers over there in the bazaar. I've forgotten the name of bazaar, I've written in my book. And he took the meter rod and banged him on his head. And he wanted to shoot the Sikh guy. So all the Sikh shopkeepers came over and overpowered him, put the machine guns, and started, like, out of frustration, they started doing Bole Sone Haal, Sat Sri Akal. And obviously it was reported. It was reported to the local Jalalabad chief. Now the local Jalalabad chief was Afghan. Now these soldiers were from Chechnya or Arab. They had no clue what Sikh was. For them, they were kafirs. The local Afghan Taliban chief said, no, these guys, I know them. They have been living here for quite a while, generation. So what you did was not right. And so they found a way to live with them. But in 2001, Taliban came up with this bright idea, okay, every Hindu Sikh needs to wear a yellow piece of cloth. It was more directed towards Hindus, because with Sikhs, because they have a turban. Even in Afghanistan, a Sikh can be identified. They wear a different type of turban, so it's quite different. And obviously, even at that time, plus the kada, with the Afghan Hindus, you cannot distinguish them. They're wearing the same Pathani suit. So they said you should wear that. And Sikh and Hindus negotiated and said, no, we can't wear it. We will. That's not right. Prior to that, they had also said you should have yellow flags on your houses. They rejected that. So the way I interpreted that is, because they were paying jizya, so they had a little bit of negotiating power. You don't kill the cow who gives you milk. So that is how in the history in Central Asia or even in subcontinent, this is how the minorities lived. They negotiated. Before they could implement the yellow thing, despite the fact that everybody says on Facebook and everybody says that they were forced to live, it was never implemented. It was never. And they were in after 9/11 in September 2001, due to the attack in America. Within 2 months, they were out of power. And then it was only after 2002, under the democratic government, the world came to know about the problems of Afghan Hindu Sikhs. So we had Bobby Singh Bansal from Leicester. He lives in Leicester in UK. He went to Kabul. He did a video documentary on how the Sikhs are living. And I think that was the first time the world knew that these people are living in Gurdwaras for so many years because their house has been occupied. And then in 2012, Pritpal Singh, Mission Afghanistan, which is on the YouTube, he visited, and he visited quite a few cities and put English subtitles and sent his documentary to a number of nations, then, so that people, because the problem was when these Sikhs were coming from Afghanistan via India to get refugee status, nobody knew that there was Sikhs in Afghanistan. They would send a Punjabi interpreter, and their Punjabi is different. They speak a more like a Hindiko, a Western Punjabi dialect, which is mixed with Pashto and Dari, depending upon which part of the country they live. So everybody in India also assumes every Sikh is from Punjab. So in their assumption, every Sikh was from India. So those documentaries did a great help, and that brought me in touch with, okay, this is a problem. What should we do about it? And I was already searching about Sindhis in Pakistan. Then I had also searching on Balochis, Hindu Sikh Balochis in that part of the country. And then I thought, okay, for my first book, I probably need to get a topic which is more relevant. And which clarify my friend, I'm not a doctor as such. I am, yes, I hold a couple of masters in management, but this is a passion. This is a passion which I've been following for the last 5-6 years. So now at the moment, so from 10,000, as I said, in about 1994, by the time Taliban left in 2001, there were only 3,006. So from 3,000, now we have about 300. So 286, about 30 Hindus. They are all in Kabul, all in Kate Parwan Gurdwara. Now the question which most people ask me, so because they did manage to find a way to live with Taliban, so what is so different now? If you look at in 2018, there was a bomb blast in which 15 Sikhs and 4 Hindus were killed in Jalalabad at a presidential rally. ISIS, Daesh took that responsibility. In last year, in 25th of March, a guy could ISIS took responsibility for that bomb. A militant came to the Gurdwara Guru Har Rai Sahib, killed the Muslim security guard outside, went inside the Gurdwara and killed at least 26 Sikh, including children and women. So if somebody comes inside your house and kills you, does security, so panic was created, and I think most people had it enough. So 400 people came at that point in August last year to India, and now they fear that they can deal with Taliban, but what about the extremist element? What can Taliban control ISIS or Daesh? Taliban's own record against Hazara Shias is very bad. So Hazara Shias are basically Shias who are basically, they have Mongol-like features. You can easily, in Afghanistan, tell from the facial features that this person is Hazara and Shia. So for Daesh, they are also kafir, fit to be killed. So if I can tell you one incident, and then a few months ago, Israel attacked the occupied territories. Every person, every Muslim country condemned it. Same day, ISIS, there was a bomb blast in a suburb of Kabul to a girls' school, which was a Hazara school. 80 schoolgirls were killed in that. Not a single nation condemned it. So the geopolitics is totally different. So if we have to think, it is worse to be in a Hazara in Afghanistan now because they can't go anywhere. Afghan Sikh and Hindus are going to come to India. Those people can't go no anywhere. And they are not a vote bank for anybody. So nobody talks about them. And as a nation and as a human race, we have a long way to go. So yesterday I got very upset about the whole thing. I was interviewed by somebody else, and the interesting that the guy also was a Shia, and he had interviewed Hazaras before. So that is the reason that now these Afghan Hindus and Sikhs want to leave the country for good. What they have decided is that people have volunteered that they will be a caretaker for the Gurdwaras. So they are about 7-8 Gurdwaras. They are 2 functional, very big mandirs. So that's 10 or 15 people will live there and rest will come to India. Yeah.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Indrajit. It was indeed, you touched another very ironical fact about the Hazara community, which has no place to go anywhere in the world. And that's a biggest irony. So my question to you before I ask Dr. Gurupdev Singh sir's question, my question to you that Afghanistan has seen so many invasions. The Russians, before that, the Mughals and the Mongolians and the Ghaznavis, I don't go for that, but the Russians, they left, the Taliban came, they also left, there again, the Americans came, they also. What prompted America to leave the country all of a sudden, one, and two, what do you see in the near future about about the status of the Talibans and about the comeback of homecoming of the communities which are now leaving the country, Afghanistan, for the other countries? What do you see about that?
Within this might be politically incorrect, but there is a fact is that in the rural Afghanistan, the government, the democratic government, was deemed as a corrupt one. So there was support, especially within the rural Pashtun areas, for Taliban. And that's a reality. Anybody who lives over there will tell you. Now, Kabul is a totally different ballgame altogether. It is one of the most modern cities in the world, not in the world, in Afghanistan. People have seen the kind of freedom. They don't want to lose that. And also, in Kabul, even I can't make it from the names. Just like in India, you can tell people surname and you can, that's its caste. I cannot tell that this is a Pashtun or Tajik. I can guess. I can make an educated guess. Kabul has a big, substantial 30 to 40% of the population is Tajik. There's a big, substantial population of Hazara. Even the Pashtuns who have seen the freedom they enjoyed, their sisters, their daughters, and others could study. There's a life bond. They don't like it. But if you leave Kabul, 50 kilometers, even if not 15, I would say 15 kilometers outside Kabul, there's a different world altogether. Americans there were only 16,000 troops in NATO troops or American troops were there in Afghanistan. Imagine those 16,000 were enough to control 50% of the country. So to say, and how many soldiers do we have in West Bank? How many soldiers do we have in Kashmir? So let's be It's not that the invincibility of Afghanistan is the problem. The problem is that you are just tackling something. You're not looking at the dynamics. The dynamics is very different over there. People, there was a smooth transition this time around in Kabul. No, there was no fight. They didn't fight in Jalalabad. They entered Jalalabad. Now people say they heavily bribed the people, those in power. That could be the thing, but there's more. There is a lot more than we are being told, at least in the Indian media. I would say, I would encourage people use internet and speak some of the BBC interviews, some of the European English channels. They are able to speak to the people who are social workers in Kabul, and they tell the things which I'm telling you.
All right, thank you. There's another question from Dr. Gaurav Desh. He's asking, who are arming Talibans? Where do they get their armament from in terms of arsenal? Are they more powerful than the American soldiers or the Afghan government? Well,
it's an open secret, isn't it? Why do you want to put me on the record and make my life more difficult? The thing is that, okay, because I'm in England, I was able to speak to people in Pakistan. I was able to speak in Afghanistan. I was able to speak to people in India because they could trust me that there's no agencies looking after bothering me. Everybody knows who's supporting Taliban. So it's, I mean, is it, do I really need to say anything? Yeah.
Yeah, and there's another question from Shruti Maladora. Then she asks, many Afghan Sikhs were stopped by the Taliban when they wanted to board the plane to leave for India. Taliban said that they were the Afghan nationals. Does this mean that the Taliban consider the Afghan Sikhs as their people and want them to stay?
Okay, let's talk about the last Taliban regime. Yeah. There was some recognition among the Afghan element of Taliban, which I shared an incident that these people, okay, they may be from a non-Islamic background, but they speak our language. They are people of my nation. And the thing is that if Sikh and Hindus leave, these are the only visible minority they have. So they will not be able to say, oh, see, everybody's happy. Even the minorities are happy. So there's a bit of a propaganda as well. So they might have tried to convince them. And there's always an element. So we are living in a social media age, which Taliban also realizes that what they want is that we should govern the country and get the funding from outside. I gave them, I wrote on Facebook and that they should invite Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras to join the government. They should use their good offices. This is Taliban. They should use their good offices to speak to Pakistan and get the Durand Line problem resolved once for all. They should speak to Islamic scholars about women education. So there's a number of things which could be done, but the short answer is yes. I would say some of them individually, let's put it this way. Within a party, you always have some extremist element or some moderate element. And obviously, the element that if all Sikh and Hindus leave, we will not be able to portray that, well, everybody's happy. Even the minorities are happy.
Thank you. Though it's a very diplomatic answer. But now
I am telling you, the thing is that if you go to India TV, yeah. India TV made a clip, Ram Saran Basin and the Sikh MP, Narinder Singh Khalsa, specifically said, we don't have a problem with Taliban. We have a problem with ISIS. We have a problem with those elements who are from Chechnya. So they are talking about the last Talibans. So basically, they did find a way. There was no bomb blast during Taliban regime last time around, but things have changed. Geopolitics have changed a big time. ISIS doesn't come. Daesh doesn't come on the negotiating table. Taliban did not destroy any mandir or gurdwaras. Yes, they didn't allow them to be rebuilt. And the Afghan Sikhs rebuilt after 2002. They didn't ask a single penny from the other Sikhs. They did it. The diaspora Afghan Sikhs rebuild all the Gurdwaras in Kabul, Jalalabad. In terms of the government built primary schools for Sikhs in Kabul, Jalalabad, and Ghazni. But after primary, they had no solution. Last year or 2 years back, funding was given, and the P. Ratanath Mandir, the Dargah P. Ratanath Mandir in Jalalabad, in Ghazni, was renovated by the government's money. The Gurdwara, Guru Nanak Darbar in Jalalabad was renovated by government's money. So government, I would say, is a little bit sympathetic, but they didn't, for 20 years, they didn't resolve the bullying problem. And people, when they go every day, they were told, come and join Islam, which every Sikh and Hindu in Afghanistan on a regular basis is invited to join. So that's not a problem. When somebody grabs you and say, oh, you kafir, I will kill you, you have to convert, then it becomes a problem. You can speak to any Hindu and Sikh in Pakistani. They are on weekly basis, they will be invited. So you get used to it. You find a way to it. But when it comes down to you're being killed for that, then you say, okay, enough. And plus the thing is that I commend these people. I would not like to live in that country. I would not like to call that my home, Haram. Despite all these things, they still considered. People came to me and said, Indrajit, you have written about my country. Afghan Hindu, he cried. He cried for it. You have written about my people, my country. He said, my country. Your people, my people, my country. So I was not being diplomatic. I was being very realistic and factual about things. Yeah, so.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I would request Dr. Sarabjot Bahel, who is also known as Kafir, to come and formally conclude this session and propose a vote of thanks on behalf of Maja House to everybody. Thank you. Over to Dr. Bahel.
Thank you, Arvinderji. And I'm proud to be a kafir rather than a fanatic. So I will take it as a compliment. And in fact, the dynamics of today's session was very interesting because we had two contrasting narratives. The first session of Professor Solte, which brought about that how a minority can assimilate. And it told a story of assimilation and synthesis. While the second part of the session by Sardar Inderjeet Singh was a story of disintegration and alienation. So first moving to what Professor Solte talked about, I think we need books like the ones which has been written by Professor Solte, which talks about the syncretic culture of India, to change the prevailing narrative of parochial and monastic view of today's India. And he has so subtly and so interestingly woven a story that how a particular minority community, melts into the indigenous culture of India, and how the Mughal influences, the Hindu influences come into the Jewish traditions of art and architecture, and especially that Seona's, interpretation, those beautiful and insightful interpretations of Seona's journey of artwork. They brought out this aspect of syncretic culture so well, in which Kali, Durga, Anasta, and all the Jewish deities and Hindu deities and Mughal influences were coming together. It was really beautiful. And being an architect myself, Professor Solte, I would really like to compliment you on the kind of documentation that you work. And I can promise you that I have got so motivated and inspired by what you have done that my next design studio would be to document this diversity of, synagogue architecture of Kochini, Baghdadi, and I would definitely take it up. Thank you for showing that direction to us. And the other contrasting narrative, which has been presented by Sardar Inderjeet Singh, which brings about horrors of persecution of a minority community, and putting these two sessions together really, gives us a lesson that, what are the lessons that we have to take from here? What is going to be our response when we attend these kind of sessions, and what we take from these sessions? I think it very clearly tells us that we need to strengthen our laws and mindset that encourage the universal values of equality and diversity, and uphold dignity of all, putting the fight against fascism, fanaticism, and work towards synchronization and synthesis of cultures and minorities and majorities of any country together, rather than going in the direction of Talibanization, fascism, fanaticism. So I think these two sessions were beautifully, contrasted, put together, juxtaposed together, and that they brought about two contrasting perspectives. Because once you have a benchmark, to compare with each other, it really gives you a perspective. So I also have to announce about the coming events, which are going to be held next weekend on Saturday and Sunday. So I would just let you know those events. And they're very interesting events again, which touch upon very uncharted territories, as Maja House keeps, addressing issues which normally are avoided at a mainstream media level. So these sessions are the Saturday session, which is going to be done on 28th August at 6 p.m. It is called Hum Surat Gar Kuch Khwabon Ki. It is going to be a session on Urdu poetry in times of hate. And there is going to be a conversation and recitations with Saif Mahmood and Mohsen Sayyed. After this, the next day on Sunday, 29th August, again at 6 p.m., is going to be a session on writing while female. And in this session, we will have Madhvi Mahadevan, Mani Rao, Janvi Barwa, Shiny Anthony, and the session will be moderated by Anupama Bishur. So thank you very much for being with us for these sessions, and looking forward to your participation in the coming sessions. And good night to everyone. I hope that we go from this session as better persons to deal with our society, our nation, and develop a balanced worldview. Thank you very much to all.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, Inderjeet ji, for the befitting talk. And thank you once again, all the audience, and see you next week. Thank you, Preeti ji.
Thank you very much. And Inderjeet, especially to you for agreeing to talk to us at such short notice, and for Munish to introduce you to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.